There it is. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I apologize for the delay. We are required by law to record these meetings, and without that, we couldn't do this. So, thank you. We'll start tonight with a Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd please join me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We've asked Commissioner Logan Johnson to share a thought or prayer to begin our meeting tonight. Commissioner?
Thank you, Chairman. As I tried to figure out a good thought, I looked towards my experience in planning school when I was studying city planning, and there was two big planners that we studied, among others. One was Jane Jacobs, and another was Ebenezer Howard. They had kind of very different ideas on how to plan a city. Ebenezer Howard had these ideas of these garden cities surrounded by massive farmland and open space, and Jane Jacobs took a little bit more of a hands-off approach. I'm going to read one of the criticisms Jane Jacobs had of Ebenezer Howard here. She said, his aim was the creation of self-sufficient small towns, really very nice towns if you were docile and had no plans of your own and did not mind spending your life with others with no plans of their own. As in all these utopias, the right to have plans of any significance belonged only to the planner in charge. Well, I wouldn't go that far, perhaps, of the criticism of Ebenezer Howard. I think the point that she made was important, that perhaps that sometimes there's a tendency in planning to reach a little too far in making plans for other people, and there can be significant resilience and value in individuals on their own. And I'd also like to offer a word of prayer, if that's okay, Chairman.
Yes.
Our dear Father in heaven, we come before Thee at the beginning of this Planning Commission meeting. We're grateful for the opportunity we have to discuss the business of the public. We ask Thee to bless us with Thy Spirit as we discuss, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Commissioner. The first matter on the agenda tonight is scheduled for a public hearing. The applicant is Fred Hale. We've been asked to consider the proposed zoning text amendment for the Hillside Overlay Zone, CZC 12.42, concerning development standards in the Hillside Overlay for agricultural zones, and turn it over to staff.
Thank you, Commissioner. So a few weeks ago, Mr. Chad Morris came to the Planning Commission seeking a text amendment for the Hillside Overlay for residential low lots, and he provided us the framework for a tiered system. So for differing the slope in the Hillside Overlay, we would differ the width of the lots. And now Mr. Fred Hale is in the middle of a subdivision application, and it has reached the same problem for agricultural zones, which are actually more restrictive within the Hillside Overlay. No matter the slope in the Hillside Overlay for agricultural lots, the width must be 125 feet. And considering that there's already a half-acre lot minimum for agricultural zones for our zoning code, he thought that this was a little bit too restrictive for his plans for a subdivision. So we, as a staff, thought it was fair to kind of mirror the residential low and the agricultural low Hillside Overlay restrictions in terms of lot width. So based on the slope of the property, anywhere between 10 and 210 to 15 and over 15, there would be different lot width restrictions. So as we just changed recently to the residential low, if it's beneath 10% slope on the property, you can keep the base zoning minimum width, which would be 60 in that case. But between 10 and 15% would have to go to 80, and then over 15% slope, you would have to be all the way to 100. To mirror that same type of tiered system in the agricultural lot, anything less than 10% slope can remain at 80 feet as a width, but over 10%, but less than 15% would have to go to 100, and then over 15% slope would be all the way at 125 feet. We thought this was just a fair way to balance the necessary width for the Hillside Overlay, but also match what we did in the residential zoning recently. And with these large lots in the agricultural zones, the code didn't necessarily do its purpose, and these houses were just getting really big and multiple retaining systems were needed anyway, as Corey explained to you before with the previous amendment. So we think that this is more tiered structure is actually more fair for the property owners themselves and still maintains those necessary requirements for the slope.
Yeah, just the one thing we talked about is, you know, should it mirror what we've done with the RL? And the answer would be no, simply from the fact that the agricultural lots are half-acre minimums. Right. And so if you went too low of a width, you would have a really long, skinny lot to get to a half acre. So we're following the same tier, but we're upping the standard on the agriculture on widths just simply to rebalance the lot configuration.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Questions for staff? If not, the applicant's here. We'd invite him to come forward if you'd like to say anything tonight.
Fred Hale again. Live here in Centerville, 63 West 1750 North. Another, you know, with this subdivision I'm trying to put in, I think what Cassie said would allow me to do this. Another fact is the front of the frontage of these lots are on a 1.5% slope road. It is a 9% slope from east to west, but there, if lot one, I don't know if you have that up on the screen, but lot one is about 230 feet wide on the street level, but the front of the house will probably be facing east. So anyway, hope you can see to pass this thing and see my way clear. So thanks. Okay. Any questions?
Any questions for the applicant? Thank you, Fred.
Mr. Chair, I think the applicant brings up a point that we have yet further to discuss as we look at revising our hillside, which has been a long-term agenda item for a while. You know, the difference is that in the case of this particular subdivision, you're seeing the street on a cross slope. And so 60, 80, 100 really doesn't make a difference on the crossing of the topography. It would be if you went with or parallel or whatever you want to call it, downslope. That's a different configuration that we still need to at some point in time refine the ordinance.
Good point. Thank you. This matter's been scheduled for a public hearing. I invite anyone who wishes to speak on this matter to come forward at this time. State your name and give us your comments.
My name is Stephen Lauder. I live at 80 East Jennings Lane, which is almost directly across from the new subdivision. In the last planning meeting, we were told by the Planning Commission that the residents of Jennings Lane that don't currently have a sidewalk, that they would not be required to have a sidewalk placed there. Our house has been there for 20 years. The street is extremely wide. We feel it an undue burden that we are made to pay for sidewalk when none has existed. There is curb and gutter. So I would like to put that in the record, that we not be forced to have added expense on our lots and for our property to be required to have sidewalk placed. And that would be the entire length of the Jennings Lane Road.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to come forward and speak on this issue?
Can I just agree without getting up there? I don't really want to get up there.
Hey, we need to get you on the record, though, if you're going to agree. All you have to do is state your name and say, I agree.
I'm Judy Hansey, and I just agree with everything that Steve Lauder just said, that we don't want sidewalk on our street. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Anyone else like to speak on this issue? Seeing no one else coming forward, I'll close the public hearing at this time. Questions, further questions by commissioners of either the applicant or staff?
Mr. Chair, the issue of sidewalk is associated with the subdivision, so I can answer that in the next item if you'd like to, or with this item, whatever you prefer.
I think it's probably better discussed at the next item.
Okay.
Because we're not really discussing the subdivision.
Right, so I'll address the sidewalk issue in the subdivision
Thank you.
plan.
I
Okay.
do just also want to mention that while we were looking over this particular zoning code, we just went ahead and striked out this line that mentions minimum sizes and lot requirements. Since we don't have a minimum lot size for residential low, it was just getting a little confusing. So I did just want to bring that up for the record, that we would recommend to just strike that line entirely from the code.
Okay, thank you.
I did have one thing. It's actually not a question, but just as that code read there were a couple things that didn't.
There are some typos in it.
Yeah, that have extra words.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to go through that? We ought to clarify that before any motion's presented.
Well,
Yeah, I think Ms. Romney had sent some suggested language. I don't know if that's been posted.
it's just on the last sentence of that. It says all lots located within slope. So we need to
All lots located within slopes greater more than 10%.
Yeah,
There's some-
greater and more. So in needed to be struck and more in my opinion. But just I
Right.
thought if that's what our code is reading.
Yeah, I noticed a few things. I just want to be consistent with the sentence structure, so these are not substantive changes, but just
Just
These are the refinements to the code language.
if those fix your concerns.
So, let's see.
Yeah, that corrects it.
So, yeah, I took out there were a couple greater mores, and then I changed the first sentence a little bit, just to say, minimum lot size and yard shall apply to all lots in the hillside overlay.
I think this is more better.
Except you still have one thing that I would recommend we change.
Yeah.
On the third line from the bottom, starting slope areas greater than 10% and less than 15% shall require a minimum lot width of 100 feet wide.
Oh, mhm.
So I think we can take out the wide width of 100 feet at the setback line.
And just for note, just for your gee whiz, minimum width
Same on the
is
bottom.
the actual code language, because the minimum width is defined versus minimum lot frontage. So minimum width is the key term to be used.
Okay,
Okay,
so that's
so-
the same in the sentence above, so it should say 10% for residential lots, 10%, and less than 15 shall require a minimum width of 80 feet
Yeah.
at the setback line.
Yeah.
And then let's do that again.
Yeah, we see
Minimum
it,
width.
I think it's 4 times.
Yep, okay, so take out lot and wide on all of those. Minimum width of 100 feet at the setback line. Great. And
Okay, thank you. Chair will entertain a motion.
I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend to the City Council to approve the proposed hillside overlay amendment, CZC 12.42.040B, as modified in our handout and amended by the Commission, with suggested reasons for findings A through E.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further debate or discussion? Not, we'll call for a vote. Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
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 Motion passes. Thank you. Second item on the agenda tonight is also scheduled to be a public hearing, again initiated by Fred Hale, applicant. Consideration of proposed preliminary subdivision for Rigby Court and 150 East Jennings Lane for 4 single-family homes in an agricultural zone. Staff?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the commission, I'll put the cart before the horse and run right to the sidewalk. And then we can address the other issues. That's the interest at hand. Just as a setup, and hopefully I explain it right so that the public's comment, they can be aware, they can have discussions if they have any concerns, also Fred, and he can understand what he would be playing here. I will talk specifically on Jennings Lane, so that seems to be the focal point of the issue. Centerville City specifications currently require, when new development comes into play, that the installation of improvements are installed associated with the land of the subdivision. That installation of improvements also includes sidewalks under the city specifications. So as it sits, if this were to move forward, Mr. Hale would be installing the public improvements on Jennings Lane solely on his property in his area that fronts Jennings Lane. That would include the curb, the gutter, the sidewalk, and those typical public improvements. So at this point in time, the code requires Mr. Hale to install sidewalk on Jennings Lane on his frontage only. And I think that's a clarification that the other residents at this time are not being required to install sidewalk on their property.
Just to clarify, so there's nothing that this development triggers that would require the people across the street to put sidewalks in?
That's the yes and no part that I want people to be very clear about. So first, addressing Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale has an option that generally staff is not supportive of, but our codes do have, is what's called a delayed improvement agreement. That is an opportunity to delay certain improvements based on certain standards, and you have that deferral concept later in your agenda to be debated. But just be it known, if whatever code's in place for the deferral, Mr. Hale can request that deferral, and it is a council decision whether that deferred. So the subject matter I'm hearing is sidewalk. So Mr. Hale, on his frontage, if there is no other sidewalks anywhere else on Jennings Lane, would have to make the argument that I qualify for putting what I call a delayed. It doesn't mean that they won't ever go in. It's just that they're delayed for a period of time, whatever is agreed to by ordinance. But as it sits right now, the requirement is for him to install the sidewalk. The other properties on Jennings Lane are not, at this point, being triggered to put in the sidewalk because Mr. Hale's putting in a sidewalk. They will not have to install sidewalk at this point in time. But that's the yes and the no. In the future, as sidewalks get constructed, the residents on Jennings Lane may see in the future an effort to begin to complete the sidewalk system. And so I think that's important to understand, that as Mr. Hale moves forward, he may be putting in the sidewalk. That doesn't mean tomorrow the rest of the sidewalk on Jennings Lane doesn't come in, but we do build as things change. So as properties change, as the city decides, oh, we need sidewalk on this road, if people have had previous delayed improvement agreements, the city may call on them. If the city decides it's time to have sidewalk, they might do a special district to install the sidewalk, and there's a public process for that, special improvement district. So there would be a lot of effort yet to be ensuing to actually install the sidewalk. But I think that's important for the residents when they're saying we don't want sidewalk. Fred, for now, will be putting it in unless he's exempted by the council for that. And at some point in the future, that may lead to a timing by the city to decide when and where sidewalks going in. My understanding, and I'm trying to remember because I wrote the report on the delayed improvement, and now I'm spacing it. I don't recall that there is a carte blanche exemption from sidewalk. We don't have that yet. What I do know is that they're in our original town center. There are areas without sidewalk. Residents in that area have wanted to, not all of them, but several of them have voiced that's part of the character, is not to have sidewalk. I hear a few in the comments that Jennings Lane may be one of those areas that maybe the city should exempt from sidewalk. We don't have that exemption at this point in time, but I'm not saying that if that's an interest of the public that they couldn't approach their elected officials and say, we want some exemptions for some specific areas for sidewalks. And then the council has to weigh the liability of not having sidewalks and the traffic and the safety and all of that before they would establish an exemption. So that's a long answer. Fred has to put sidewalk on his subdivision on Jennings unless approved otherwise. The residents do not have to install sidewalk because of Fred's subdivision, but someday in the future, sidewalk may be an issue. And if they, by character, do not want that sidewalk, there would have to be another provision adopted in the city to exempt sidewalk for Jennings Lane. Hope that answers it, at least gives it a parameter, and they can have discussions and so on for in the future if they so wish not to truly not have sidewalk, which I know some other areas have the same desire. At least along this area, sidewalk doesn't fit the identity of our street. So now we can get to the matter at hand. Fred wants to get his preliminary subdivision approval. So he has come to the city on a concept, 4 lots in an agricultural. He is in the hillside area. His slope is less than the 10%, just barely, but he's less than 10%. So we will still develop in the hillside. My report is heavy in the recommendations. That heaviness is coming because Mr. Hale would like to proceed because we are in December. You only have a meeting once this month, and waiting to next month just puts that much time in between the effort of getting the construction of the subdivision. So he asked to be maintained on the agenda. We actually had pulled him off at one point in time. And so he requested in my office to come back and be on the agenda. My main component for originally trying to pull him off was primarily based on we had not received the geologic study and the soil study. And it's clear in the preliminary plan that that has to be done as part of your preliminary subdivision. He was able to pull some strings on the geotech. He was able to submit to Kevin the geotech. Kevin is our city engineer. The geotechnical report has come back with very minimal problems with the property from a geologic standpoint. There's no problems from a soil standpoint. It's pure sand. And so the idea, a recommendation in the report is that the roof drains need to have sufficient dispersal and sheet flow to just not flood out into a single area. So that's all I recall that was in the report that was submitted to our city engineer. Our city engineer was comfortable with the preliminary approval. It's your city planner that wasn't quite comfortable, and I'm not the engineer. There are a lot of technical slope issues with retaining and the right-of-way. You can see that the street is on the eastern side of the property. There's a significant fill. There's a small cut and then a significant fill for the roadway. There is this concept in the hillside in an engineering that cut and fill slopes need to be at least 3 feet away from the public right-of-way. The concept is we don't want cuts and fills coming into our right-of-way. We want stable shoulders to the roadway. It also says that when you do cuts and fills in the right-of-way, we want to make sure that our road is stable. And both of those provisions are not clear to me from an engineering-wise, because I'm not an engineer, they're not clear to me when they're satisfied. So the example that I see from my perspective is you have a significant fill slope on the western side of the proposed road. What will likely happen if this was approved is that the homes will capitalize on that, fill the rest of their front yard, and you'll likely have a slope off on the foundations to a walkout basement. That's the likely 99.9% going to be the design of the homes. The concern I have is just to make sure that the technical merits of these fills and cuts, that somebody doesn't inadvertently come in and take away the fill next to the right-of-way, and we have a failure of a road because they've undermined the fill. And I haven't got a clear technical answer from Kevin on that yet, our city engineer. And so that's where it's weighted and heavy. I'm trying to say, okay, if we're gonna advance the preliminary, if you're comfortable, that's up to you to decide if you're comfortable. I still think that the construction drawings and the engineering part with Kevin need to be refined to make sure that we're meeting the hill slope cuts and fill standards. And so I don't have an answer of whether Kevin's comfortable with the cuts and the fills. Preliminarily in our discussions, he seems to be, but I don't have something in writing from the engineer. And so what I've wrote in that heaviness is these parameters, and then said, will the commission be comfortable, since it's a technical issue, allowing the DRC, that's where Kevin and myself and Cassie and Lisa and the Public Works, we function. Are you okay assigning that group the task to make sure that the technical engineering is done before they move on to final? If there's a dispute at that DRC group and the developer, then they would simply not move to final. They would come back to the commission so that we can have the debate and solve and achieve a resolution. If the DRC can and cover those bases, then you've assigned the DRC to okay it, and then they would proceed to final, and you would still see the final. You're going to still, it's not like this is your only shot. They will bring back the final, the construction drawings, and we'll be able to answer whether the DRC or how the DRC and the developer resolve those issues. So it's really your call. Do you want to see that first? Do you want to allow it to be assigned to the DRC? Come back if there's a dispute before the final. I'm leaving it up to you. But I crafted it to move forward. It's up to you to decide if you're okay with that. So our recommendation with that specific assignment is to move it forward.
Thank you, Corey. Questions for staff? Invite the applicant to come forward if you'd like to make any further comment.
Fred Hale again. In the staff meeting, we talked a lot about this and about the slopes and that, as far as the fill. So what we have is we have the curb and then the park strip and then the sidewalk. And Corey and Kevin and my engineer were talking about even going beyond the sidewalk. I can't remember, Corey, 3 feet or something like that.
Whatever's necessary.
Compacted fill. And then, but that would be an issue. If somebody were to come in and, and cut right by the sidewalk, it may slope off. But what the beauty of this subdivision is going to be very nice because you have that slope from east to west, and you're going to have a flat driveway with a walkout basement. But that is a concern that we'll have to, I think what we talked about is to put it right on the drawing is that fill has to go beyond the sidewalk 3 or 4 feet. I can't remember.
Yeah, we'd have a slope easement that protects that from the cut. I mean, in all reality, the houses are going to go in and fill in, and it'll maintain that slope. But you just once in a while have somebody who has a creative mind and does something different. And we just can't afford to have the failure of the public road at that point in time. So I think we can get there, but I'm just uncomfortable representing that
we're there.
That we're there.
Gotcha. Great.
Okay.
Anything else?
Nope, that's all.
Any questions for the applicant? Thank you, Fred. This matter's been scheduled for a public hearing. I invite anyone who would like to come speak on this matter to come forward at this time. And certainly those who have spoken before will take your comments into consideration on the sidewalk. Anyone else? Okay. Well, oh, please.
I'm Julia Peterson. My husband Red and I just live, our backyard will back up to Fred Hill's new backyard. And my only concern for 1825 North side is just the secondary water. So I'm just a little more curious about like the main water lines, the public water lines, the public works, and the secondary water, because there was talk that we would have to get the water coming in from 1825 North, which that I didn't love. So I would just be more curious. I don't know like how far along in the planning we are, but I would be more curious about the public works side of it. And then the second thing is I'm really happy with this plan. It could be way worse. We really like Fred. I think it's awesome to only have 4 houses behind us, but that's my biggest concern is the water.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak? Thank you for those comments. I'll close the public hearing at this time. Good question. Do you know? Do you have any idea on the
Yes, I
water
think,
supply and where that would be?
I think it would be good to Fred to give you the details of it. What I can tell you is that the sewer line will be running from Jennings Lane. That's part of the alley system that's in the conditions of approval. I think the sewer line will also run on the downside of the lots in that private alley area. Our storm drain will be connected. Our water line is going to be connected. That's the culinary water line. I do think our code requires a secondary water establishment. I don't think you're forced to always use it for irrigation, but you're required by city ordinance to use secondary water, or at least connect it. I think that is a design matter that they have to finalize. We will require it. I know there was original plans to go down at the bottom of Jennings Lane and bring it up. I think that the secondary irrigation company has raised some issues with pressure with that, and I'll let the developer represent the discussions with them about that.
Okay, thank you. Fred.
Yeah, Corey's correct. When I first started inquiring about the property, I checked secondary water, and Weber Basin told me I could go to Main Street and pick it up there and bring it east. Then when we started, in fact, they said that even up 2 or 3 months ago. Now they've changed their mind and said that I've got to go get it somewhere else. Their first choice is go east, and there's the main trunk line that's up on top. There's a line that does drop down into George Fidel's area. Then what I'd need to do is pick it up there and bring it down Jennings Lane and then into the subdivision, or go on 1825 and pick it up on 1825 and bring it south into our easement out the back of the properties there. So that has not been confirmed yet, but Weber Basin is almost like dealing with UDOT. They don't respond very quickly. So anyway.
So in summary, he'll be required to have Weber Basin send in the requirements that has been met to meet their secondary irrigation. Now, if there's public ways and public utility easements to run that line, that's a configuration to be, finalized. If it requires obtaining easements through properties that don't have easements, that'll be the developer's effort to talk to those individuals that may be the best configuration and see if they'll cooperate with that configuration. But the subdivision wouldn't be able to be finalized until the secondary irrigation has been addressed.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other response to anything, Fred, that's been said tonight?
What's that?
Any other response to anything else that's been said tonight? Thank you. Okay. We'll turn the time back over to the commission for discussion and debate. Any further questions for staff or the applicant? Okay, very good. Chair will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion for Planning Commission to approve the preliminary plan for the Rigby Court subdivision with directives 1 through 6 in the staff report and suggested reasons for actions A through E.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate on the motion?
I just want to state that I'm not totally comfortable with moving forward with the concerns with the cut and fill on the road. So I know I totally trust that the city will address that and make it happen, but I still think it should wait until that is addressed and we have that in writing.
Before we approve preliminary? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So
I do.
with reason number 6, or, okay.
Yeah, is it reason number 6?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
that's a
I agree,
directive.
of course, we can address it. I just, as an engineer, I can't in good conscience feel good about moving that forward without that approval from the city engineer.
Any other points you'd like to make? We'll bring the matter to a vote. We'll start with Commissioner Hayman.
Aye.
Aye.
No.
Aye.
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 Matter passes with 1 dissenting vote. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for...
Mr. Chair, may I address the applicant?
Pardon me?
May I address the applicant?
Of course.
We got to get that fixed before we go to final.
Yes, I would agree. Thank you. Item number 3 on the agenda is also scheduled for public hearing. John Stout is the applicant, and this is a consideration of a conceptual subdivision for the condominium conversion for Boulder subdivision at 60 North and 1400 West.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
don't want to sound like a broken record. I work in the building under consideration on this one, so I'm going to step down. And then the next item, I work for the applicant as well. So for items 3 and 4, I'm just going to join the audience.
Okay, you recuse yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On camera.
Turn the time to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commission, we don't see this too often. Conversions of projects into a condominium plat. That's a kind of a rarity. It's really governed under the Condominium Act of the state. Our subdivision ordinance references that Condominium Act. I think I provided it in the staff report. But there's very little substance in the subdivision ordinance other than you got to comply with that act. So we have a site. It's approved. It's part of a previously approved subdivisions. It's one of the lots. In this particular case, there is a shared access and parking agreement between 2 lots. The lot in question is on the south side. I believe True Golf is the business occupier, and I believe of the entire building. The owners of the building have come to us and said, True Golf's great. We anticipate a continued wonderful relationship, but the future's the future, and you never know when True Golf has designed the greatest simulator, and they move to Pebble Beach and have their headquarters located there. So they and as an investment purposes, would like to create 4 suites, if you will, and convert those into condominium suites. Right now, for the short future, from what I understand, they can explain that's True Golf. They're going to occupy the whole building. It's going to continue on that way so long as that conditions exist. But they do want to set their investment up for a future to convert and be able to portion off different areas of the building and offer those as a product to others in the future. You know, from the point of staff, the merits is all in the Condominium Act. They've got to create all of the CC&Rs and the controlling documents that define which area, you know, which airspace, is it the walls, is it the interior airspace, here's the parking lot, here's the landscaping, here's what all of you are going to contribute as owners of the property if it's sold. That's probably 95, 96% of really this conversion. And I don't see a lot at this point from the technical place for the conversion. But two factors that come into play. Staff just wants to make sure that the building officials involved, he's been in contact. They've actually have a permit in process for some remodeling of the interior. We just want to make sure that the building codes, because once you start dividing off properties at some point in time, building codes come into play. And I just want to make sure that they're comfortable with it. Preliminarily, he's had discussions and from a code perspective, from the fire code, it's a sprinkled building already, so there's not a lot of worries and conversions from his standpoint. The larger one is maybe a zoning issue. We just raised the issue that right now there is a single user and there's sufficient parking for the single user. It's industrial warehouse space. The counts of parking have been calculated that way in the original design, and we're set up for industrial office warehouse space. The only place that we raise an issue is once you create a condominium, you now have multiple users, and you might have a user that wants to come in, and now the demand of parking changes. And typically what happens is you catch those as they come in for tenant finishes, business licenses. Those are the type of places where it triggers a review, but that's always after somebody's negotiated a lease, after somebody's done that. So I include that we ought to put into the plat notes for the condominium and controlling documents that they understand that the parking is calculated on this office warehouse space, and that they need to stay within those parameters. Now that's not to say it couldn't change. If somebody bought 2 spaces and there was sufficient parking to cover it and just converted 2 spaces into a single user. There's a lot of variables, but I just think buyers need to know up front. And so I've suggested that be addressed in their documents. But under our subdivision, they've got to come to you for conceptual. This is the idea of getting feedback. They come back with their preliminary. This is where we'll begin to finalize the lines and the configuration and the early plat. And then they'll come back with their final plat and all of the documents. So we don't see there's a need to hold it up at conceptual because a lot of the work is going to be coming at final. Sure. So we're recommending you accept it.
Thank you, Corey. Questions for staff? Invite the applicant to come forward at this time if you'd like to and address the staff report or any other items that you would like to address.
We've addressed I think we've addressed most of the parking problems that we've had down there, the ideas that there could be with doing this. We've also, I think that with the way we've divided it up, if there was ever to be a difference in tenants, they would be smaller tenants than what's there now. The parking would probably get lighter, if anything, from what we've seen. We own several of these, and that's what we see in our other buildings.
And could you just state your name for the record?
Oh, I'm John Stout.
Thank you, thank you, John. Yeah. Questions for the applicant? Thank you very much. This matter's been scheduled for public hearing. Invite anyone who would like to come forward and address this issue at this time to do so. Seeing no one rushing forward, I'll close the public hearing, turn the matter back over to the commission for further comment. Any concerns, any questions? We lost Kevin, but I think we still have a quorum. Let me just state something for the record. Having done some of these conversions in my day and having seen it done, actually having taken some property out of condominium and back into rental as well, I find that condominiums like these tend to add to the viability of the businesses because there's a sense of ownership of the property as opposed to just being a rental. And so generally I find it to be pretty well a good idea as long as the CCNRs and the association are well formed. So I would generally be in favor of it. Any further comment? We'll go ahead and let's see. I think we can move to a vote on this, or no, a resolution. I'm sorry.
How about I make a motion?
Yes.
For the Planning Commission to accept the conceptual plan for the Boulder condominium subdivision with directives 1 through 5 in the staff report for suggested reasons A through C.
Thank you.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? We'll go ahead and vote. Commissioner Hayman?
Aye.
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 Aye. Motion passes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Item number 4 on the agenda is also scheduled to be public hearing. This is consideration of the proposed conceptual subdivision for small subdivision waiver for Legacy Commons development at 1250 West and Parish Lane. As previously noted, Commissioner Logan Johnson has recused himself from consideration of this matter. Turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. This is an interesting project, and so you see a little bit of weighted information in the staff report on it. As you're most likely aware, this is the Legacy Commons site. This is a planned development, and it was accepted by the city. We have a hotel, some commercial pads, and a residential, multifamily residential component that is approved as part of the project. The City Council has accepted that PDO plan, and now they are moving forward. And my understanding, in a rough time frame, the council required the hotel in the first phase to be constructed first with the foundation poured before they're allowed to move on to any other project. So my understanding is the hotel is interested in acquiring the property fairly soon. That's the first phase. The tentative plan is the first half of 2018 to be underway with that, and then the second half of 2018 the large lot, or lot 1, would start proceeding to the final site plan process. But currently, the applicant, Spencer Wright, needs to divide the property and secure the purchase of lot 2 for the hotel. And they've wanted to do that as typical on time a couple of months ago. And we're already into December, and they want to move forward with that. Under your subdivision ordinance, or under state law, you can exempt, under state law, so I'll address that, you can exempt 10 lots or less from the subdivision platting ordinance. That's the official linen, signatures, so forth. You can exempt, a city can choose to exempt 10 lots or less from the formal platting process. Centerville is very conservative. We say that at 2. So we could have drawn at 4 or 5, but Centerville says 2. And Centerville says, and with those 2 lots, here's the criteria. And so it's typically that you're not part of a pre-subdivision, anything in the past 3 years, that you don't need to dedicate a road. So it's basically saying, hey, you're in a developed area with streets. We don't have a master plan going through a street so you don't have to dedicate a new street. And if it's 2 lots or less, we'll let you skip the platting process and record your meets and bounds. Now, our ordinances open it up that you can plat it or use your meets and bounds. It's a small subdivision. And the Planning Commission is the final land use authority decision on those small subdivisions. The interesting part is you get the whole thing in one application. You usually don't see small subdivisions in 3 different steps. It's just, here it is, approve it. And that's the difficult part of subdivisions if they have any complexity to them. So this qualifies under the criteria. There's no master plan street. It's on existing streets. It meets all the subdivision waivers. But the unique part of it is it's in a PDO, and access on Parish Lane is not really likely going to happen. Now, I do disclose to you they still want to go as part of the PDO. There is a limited drop lane and right-hand turn allowed under the conceptual plan to go into the hotel site. But we also know UDOT owns a restricted no-build line there. So they're still trying to see if they can convince UDOT to get that drop lane for a ride in, and our PDO allows them to do that. But that's not the requirement of a road dedication. Now, what I think later is if UDOT by chance ever approved that, there may be a dedication later for the drop lane before you enter into the site, or they would create an aisle separation on site for the drop lane. I mean, that configuration, we just don't know. But right now, all the access is designed off of 1250 West. And I think that's where the uniqueness comes in. Lot 1's is a cross access, or Lot 2 is a cross access through Lot 1 to 1250 West. So we need to be able to handle that as part of the planning of the small subdivision. It's not like these are just two completely independently functioning lots. They need each other in the master plan for cross access. The other thing is if you're creating two lots, the original developer needs to put in those minimum public improvements. And so that's part of the discussion is okay, each lot will have their portions of improvements, but as far as establishing the trunk lines, the utility lines, the sewer lines, the water lines, dedicating a cross-access agreement between the two lots, and then the installation of improvements, the public improvements that happen at subdivision need to be a part of the construction drawings. And so I think for the developer, there's still a little bit of a gap because it's not just two lots on a road. It's two lots integrated in a planned development. And so I think we do have a gap between the small subdivision in its idealistic, simple form and something that's a planned development. And so I tried to write it. The expectation from my standpoint is it's best to plat this better than create a bunch of narratives about cross-access and lanes and easements and so forth. So my choice and suggestion is that they still plat this because it's better in a format. And I don't, yes, it costs more for linen, but I think by the time you pay a surveyor to write a bunch of language versus survey it and draw it out on a plat, I don't know how much of a win you have on finances, but I guess Spencer can decide that. But we're expecting a plat with the cross-access agreements and construction drawings for the minimum public improvements. But this is a one fell swoop. Planning Commission, you approve the subdivision. Staff has then got to go back and prepare the impact fees, the bond amounts, and all that in preparation of the recording. And again, that's a lot of technical stuff that has to take place before it can be recorded. So hopefully I covered those conditions. It technically qualifies for a small subdivision, but it's a little more complicated than just two lots. So the question is are you okay with staff working out the details? And we always dislike that because if we have a disagreement, then it's always a tough place. But I think the PDO plan, the expectations and conditions of the approval of the PDO plan, the phasing that's approved with the PDO plan, I think we can just, at a staff level, take the PDO approval, match it with the small subdivision, get the construction drawings and bonds amounts created, and record. So we're saying consider accepting it.
Thank you. Corey, questions?
And this is sort of a tangential issue, but do we have any idea why UDOT, I mean, I know UDOT operates for its own reasons, some of which is hard to know, but do we have any idea why they're resistant to putting a drop lane here? I mean, it seems like a very natural place for me to put it, particularly because you're going to be slowing down to take a right if you're headed out that direction to go onto Legacy anyway. So it seems kind of like a very logical place to put a right lane only there.
Yeah. That's a great question.
To the, I agree with what you're saying, but it's too close to the ramp. I mean,
too
I know
close
that's
how though?
part of the problem.
Well, it's
I don't know.
what it comes down
I'm
is
not the transportation engineer, but I
this is
I
a
know
category.
that's
Parish Lane is a Category 3 road under UDOT's design standards. They've classified it as a Category 3. And unfortunately, I spent probably 3 hours at the UDOT office making these arguments about what's going on here. And you know, I'm a little planner from Centerville in the UDOT system. I learned that very quickly. The simple explanation is it's a Category 3. Category 3 is to minimize curb cuts to the road. And that means that they want accesses to be off all the local roads. You know, part of the argument of a Category 3 road I went up there with is look at Parish Lane East, and you're nowhere close, and you'll nowhere ever be close in meeting a Category 3 definition. So I kept saying, why are you hanging on to this? And they said, well, yeah, you're right, but west, it could be a Category 3. And I said, because you have a long ramp, and there's no pressures that way for those accesses. And I said, but you have one across the street, so it makes sense why you're resisting so much here. And they said, because that came under a court order, not under our approval. So there was a lawsuit filed to get the Maverick access in place. Otherwise, UDOT was not going to approve it. So that's a component, they say. So the Category 3 on the north side runs from the interchange to interchange. And you have a 1250 West Street that can provide access to this project. Therefore, we're not going to approve. And the way we're not going to approve it is not just under the administrative rules. We purchased the value of a no access line, and we have no interest right now in selling that. And that's one where you kind of hold the trump card, wrong term maybe, but you hold the card that gets in the way. They purchased a value, own it, and they don't right now intend to sell it.
It just strikes me as elevating form over function.
Yeah, because it would be like 2 cuts on the street. From
well, now you're talking like Frank Lloyd Wright, and I agree with you there.
Yeah, good point. Not something we could probably deal with.
So did they own that same right on the Maverick site?
They did at one point in their view, but the problem is you're going back to the legacy negotiation for the Legacy Parkway, and you had a dispute, and it took a court to settle that dispute about the acquisition of that right-of-way for Legacy.
So they could pursue the same thing?
Well, they would have to go back and argue that there's a similar story to what the other property owner had to, and I think UDOT's version on this is that we purchased the value where the other one we had not purchased well, there was a dispute on what the value of the property was and whether they had purchased that no access line. This one
this one was a separate land transaction.
Yeah.
So I think they actually.
That's what I was wondering, if they had the same thing.
It's apples and oranges in the end. Same outcome in the sense of getting legacy right-of-way property, but disputes with each other are a little different under that project.
Yeah. Thank you for that explanation. Good question. Wish there was some way we could deal with it, but I don't think we can at this point. Let's see, is the applicant here? Would the applicant like to come up and discuss the staff report on this? Please.
Hi, this is on Spencer Wright, 1178 West Legacy Crossing Boulevard.
Welcome.
I don't have anything to add, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for me.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. Any questions for the applicant?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This matter's been scheduled for public hearing. Any members of the public out there that would like to come forward at this time? You're recused, but you're still a member of the public.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, UDOT, Gina reminded me a little bit, engineers are really careful. I mean, you noticed the vote she had earlier. I think engineers just tend to be
conservative.
Too careful.
Probably
My name is Logan Johnson from Centerville.
Thank you, Logan. Any further, turn the time back, we'll close the public hearing. Turn the time back over to the commissioners. Any further comment or questions for the applicant or staff? Any debate? Chair will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion for the Planning Commission to approve the small subdivision waiver lot split for the Legacy Commons subdivision with conditions 1 through 3 as stated in staff's report and the suggested reasons for the actions A through D.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? Not, we'll go ahead and put the matter to vote. Commissioner Daly?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Next matter on the agenda, item number 5, and we welcome Commissioner Johnson back, is initiated by the City Council. This is a consideration of proposed zoning text amendment to CZC 12.55 regarding deferred agreement allowances, which is a subject that we've discussed already tonight and in previous meetings. Turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to let Lisa get the credit for drafting all of this. It is a zoning code change, so the report is addressing it from the zoning standpoint. There are 2 codes in the city that address deferral agreements. There were subtle differences. The council asked to resolve those subtle differences, and I think Lisa's prepared a draft that she can explain to you how the deferrals work if you want to know the details. And simply what we're doing is using the zoning ordinance to use as a reference to the actual process and strike out the process within the zoning ordinance. And since it's covered adequately, us as staff are recommending approval, but Lisa can give you the details, which I think important. In fact, those on Jennings Lane would have been interested maybe to hear.
I thought we might have them stick around.
They went home to watch it on YouTube.
There you go. You get more treats. They don't have the treats.
Right.
Yeah.
Turn some time over to Lisa. Tell us what you've done here.
Thank you. I think Corey described it well. We address deferral agreements in 2 sections, one in our municipal code under streets and then also in our zoning code. So the council wanted us to match those up because they had different standards, and we used one of those as a loophole to approve one, but they wanted it tightened up, which I think is reasonable. So what I did was try to put all the substance and the process into Title 10, which is streets, because really this is more of an issue for the Public Works Department and the City Council, because we're deferring public improvements. Staff's recommendation on these is usually that we not defer things. When you come in with a subdivision, you pay for the public improvements like everybody else. That's how we get our streets built and our sidewalks built. Right. If it doesn't go in then, when will it? And we've had a number of these examples. So at a staff level, we always try to make sure that the applicant understands they need to put in all the public improvements. But oftentimes they have reasons, or they want to get out of that obligation, and other times there is very good reasons, like when there's not a sidewalk on the street. So we'll take the Jennings Lane example, or in some of our townside areas here, there are no sidewalks at all, and so in those cases it does make sense to defer the sidewalk. Now we have been requiring them more so in our old town side, and I will say we've connected a lot of sidewalks. So I think that's good. But for purposes of these ordinance amendments, I did add in a lot more detail on the application. I like to put the burden on the applicant to give us all the information we need to make the decision. So I've added in on the request for deferral a lot more information about what we want them to give us. And then also added a section on the required factors for deferral. And so this is probably what we really need to be looking at on page 3 of the ordinance, subsection F. These are now the factors that the city council must decide. So really we wanted them to look at a checklist so that it's not just, oh, I think we'll approve this or not. You know, we want to make it objective, and the default should be that the sidewalks go in or the public improvements. But if the council finds that there's good cause and makes the following findings, that it's a legally conforming lot or parcel, so obviously we don't want an applicant to be able to defer something when they don't have a required lot. That lot or parcel also has to have frontage on the public street, otherwise we wouldn't really be requiring these kinds of improvements. And then here's the next one is no street improvements exist, so that would be either sidewalk or curb and gutter, or whatever they're requesting to be deferred. None of those improvements exist on the same side of the street contiguous to the parcel in both directions. Now, we've had some trouble with that with recent applications. The council finds it very sympathetic. Sometimes people have really good reason. Like one of the examples was up here on the hill, someone was actually just remodeling, and so the sidewalk hadn't gone in because it was a really old lot. They were remodeling, which triggered review and the sidewalk going in. And they were remodeling because there was someone with disabilities going in, and so the council was persuaded to not require them to put the sidewalk in, even though there were sidewalks on one side or the other. So I've put in some wiggle room here that we'll see whether the council wants that or not. So I said there's no street improvements on either side in both directions unless otherwise approved by the council based upon good cause. So they still have to make some sort of finding as to why, you know, not just that the person doesn't have money or they don't want to do it. And then the last one, also that the lot or parcel is not within a recorded subdivision. Because initially we were saying it, you know, if it's in a subdivision, you need to put in all those improvements, and we don't want to have to debate that with every new subdivision that comes in. But again, we had some interesting examples. I think the most recent one was Mr. Samuelson. It turns out that big lot that he had without a sidewalk was not part of a subdivision. Oh, well, so that one worked, but where was the one? Maybe that.
It was it the one where they had to make such a cut for the front yard? And and then the other one was the disability.
Yeah, oh, and then there was one that was a corner lot, right. It was similar, just across the street. So I put in more wiggle room that even if it's in a recorded subdivision, then it can be approved by the council based upon good cause. And then added this sentence, though, provided no deferral of improvements shall be allowed as part of a new subdivision development. Well, let's take Fred Hale's project. That would prohibit him from getting out of it. And again, I was trying to really tighten it because we argue all the time with developers about they don't want to put in improvements. And so we thought we would draw the line because it's a brand new subdivision. And in brand new subdivisions, you really should put in the public improvements. But I see that example here.
Unless it's, I think the provision, unless it's a designated area that we're not going to require sidewalks. And I think that's the part, we haven't decided in the city the appropriate areas to say it's not designated.
Well, true, and I do reference the designated areas. So we haven't, what we would like to do as staff is actually analyze all the deferral agreements that are out there. Where are they? How do they connect? And then also analyze what areas where in the city do we not have sidewalks and it makes sense, like in the old town side area where we really just say as a policy we're not going to require sidewalks on these streets. So I did put that in under subsection 3 that says there's no sidewalks in either direction, or the lot or parcels in an area of the city specifically designated as an area where sidewalks are not required. So I guess we could pull that language back down, and if Jennings Lane was ever designated, or you could just end the thing, end number 4 to say it's not within a recorded subdivision unless otherwise approved by the council based upon good cause. Because I could see that Rigby Court is a good example. We would probably require the sidewalk going along into the subdivision on the cul-de-sac, but maybe not on Jennings Lane if it really isn't anywhere. So that might be something for the Planning Commission to struggle with or recommend. And then I went ahead and took everything out in the zoning code and said, we're regulating this in the streets section, not zoning.
Yeah, so the default of the zoning code is improvements go in unless somehow you go to the municipal code and get exempted.
Thank you. It seems to me that we could avoid this issue of the new subdivision development in item 4 under F, under section 2F, if we simply added, unless such new subdivision is an area of the city specifically designated as an area where no sidewalks are required.
Yep.
Otherwise, I think you've got an issue there, possible new, lot split subdivision or something in one of the designated areas that would conflict with what we've previously done.
Yeah, and that's a reasonable solution. It probably won't help on the Rigby Court because that's a long-term project for the next summer intern, but because we haven't designated any areas yet, or we have not done a complete survey of.
But I can see some new subdivisions possibly coming into some designated areas if there's some infill or something like that could.
And the citizens who had public comment, at least here, would have an avenue in the long run to try to make theirs designated and try to justify.
Yes, we did try to account for that, knowing long-term, and again, staff has talked about this, that it would be great to actually designate certain streets where it just doesn't make sense to, I mean, it has that quaint appearance, and the neighborhood doesn't want the sidewalks in their established neighborhoods, but when they come in for remodel or others, it does trigger the sidewalk requirement. They would generally be deferred because, again, this actually doesn't provide for a waiver or an exemption except for in those designated areas.
So if there's a new, like taking Jennings Lane, there's a lot of land to be developed where that ends. When those come in, will they be required to have sidewalks?
Well,
And would that
I
then
think
go
that's the
down
discussion is if we're going to designate areas with no sidewalk, is Jennings Lane an area that we want to do that on? And I don't think we can answer that question yet. Right now, the distance it goes, it's a quaint street, but as more hillside development ensues on a sloped area, we have to ask ourselves, is that the right place to exempt or build what we can with new development and then infill later as time ensues?
Is this whole idea of designating areas, is that something that would be appropriate to get input from the Landmarks Commission? Because that whole idea of quaintness and this is how it historically looks seems to be right up their alley. Is that?
Yeah, the impetus for my experience has been the landmarks, and people who have participated in the landmarks process have been generally resistant in the Old Town area of the city coming in and requiring sidewalks. And so I think that's part of the stakeholder input is, okay, Old Town, who's the stakeholder here? Well, you have the residents, but you also have the Historic Landmarks Committee, they're the landmarks now. And we would seek their input as we debate whether that would be an area of exemption. But I think that's a good basis for even considering, because somebody says, well, I just don't want them. Well, I don't know if the liability of people walking in the street just because a few people don't want them is justification. I think it has to have a component to it. Like if we had an agricultural preservation area, I mean, this is where I get in trouble with the engineers. Why have curb and gutter in those areas?
He's in deep thought. I heard you.
Why have curb and gutter on rural streets? It's part of the component of a rural street. So, yeah, I think the long answer is yeah, I think that's the stakeholder weigh-in is the historic nature, the value for this particular area to exempt.
I'm generally fine with the idea of designating areas where sidewalks aren't required. I tend to take a really narrow view of that. I mean, I would be in favor of requiring, when people remodel in the Old Town area, to require them to put in sidewalks. I had kids who walked from, Centerville Junior High to Centerville Elementary every day and in the snow. That means that with all the snowbanks pushed up, my kids are walking in the street to school every day, and not just my kids, a lot of other kids that I saw. So I would be in favor of narrowing that approach, and that's just my own take on that.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, as part of a designated area, part of the criteria is, safe routes to school. So maybe in an area, a certain route will be eventually sidewalk, but the others may not. And then this is risk management. If you have people walking out on the road regularly, you know what the claims that come along statistically. Somebody's going to slip, fall, get hurt, hit, who knows what. So we have to be careful about just using the designation area too broadly.
I also recognize that you don't want to be the first one to have to put it in, right? If you're in the old district and you have your sidewalk that goes along your property and it doesn't connect up to anything, you find yourself scratching your head thinking, why did I just have to put in a sidewalk?
Right.
But eventually, those sidewalks will connect. And eventually, you know, you're going to be the weird neighbor that doesn't have a sidewalk in front of your house. And so I think that it's something that we should probably encourage. I have two questions for you, Lisa. The first is, if we were to go this designation route, where would somebody find that? So if I'm reading this code section and it says, you know, that there's this exemption for specifically designated areas, where would I go to find that?
I would anticipate an ordinance amendment, and I would probably put it right in this section.
Okay.
But since we haven't done it yet, I mean, we were kind of just slotting it in there since we were thinking about it, but I guess you could even take it out until we do that is another option, because I don't want people to think, you know, right now I would say, well, no, there's no specifically designated area.
I don't necessarily oppose putting it as a placeholder when we don't have anything designated yet, but I wouldn't be opposed to waiting to drop it in later to avoid any confusion.
Mm-hmm.
My other question for you is at subsection 3, where you say no street improvements exist on the same side of the street contiguous to the latter parcel, meaning, define contiguous to me. I mean, are we talking like there's not a cross street that interrupts it, right? So if I've got 5 lots and then a cross street, it's anybody that's in between the 2 cross streets, or do you know what I mean? How far does that go?
I think I was just trying to say that it's right next to the street. So there's no street improvements on the street that's right in front of your house. But you could probably take it out if you say no street improvements exist on the same side of the street. Well, actually I like it, because it's the frontage, you know, like we're not really talking if there's a street behind them, but that's not contiguous to their lot. So I was just trying to say right
not to further complicate it, but it just struck me when you asked the question. I could see a situation where you have 3 lots, everybody else has sidewalk, but you got these 3 undeveloped parcels as an infill. The center one comes in. They wouldn't be contiguous, but we're so close. You're only 1 lot away.
Oh, I see what you mean, because there's a street coming in. So does this?
Right,
I
that's
see
my
what you're
question.
saying. Yeah, okay.
And I'm further complicating it by saying, what if you're just somehow it's only 100 feet and you've got 50 of it and everybody else has 25 and you're right in the center. And, oh, it's not on contiguous to mine, so if I install it, it's 20 feet away still. And it's like, no, come on, you're
I mean, I totally
close.
understood what you were trying to do. I was just wondering, based on the language, if it was a little ambiguous.
Well, or necessary. So no street improvements exist on the same side of the street. I guess you could say adjacent to the lot, on the same side of the street to the lot. Yeah, I guess I was just trying to say the street right in front of the lot. So this street, so the contiguous would relate to the frontage of the lot and the street. In one or both directions. So I guess it still makes sense to me.
And then I say, or within reasonable distance. And that's really fluffy.
But even if you had that break, like let's say we're talking about this corner lot here, this is still the same, well.
Would you view it as contiguous?
Mm-hmm.
Across the street? No, on the same side of the street, but where a through street comes, right? So like think 30s that runs, and then you've got all the souths, right, like cutting it up into slices. Where does the contiguous stop?
Yeah, I guess you could do a distance, but,
This is why ordinance writing is so difficult.
Yeah, I don't know how you say it differently. Honestly, I read it and it was reasonably clear to me. I didn't see the ambiguity.
If it works for all of you, that's fine. That was just my only.
No, I like it because somebody is going to do exactly like that someday in the future. I don't know if we can cover it, but I agree with you. At some point in time, somebody's going to say, what do you mean? And we're going to say, you're reasonably close. You're reasonably there.
Well, and I get that that's what you're trying to get at, right? I mean, it's not like a mile away. That's not contiguous.
well, and again, I'm saying the contiguous is modifying the street in front of the lot. That's what I'm saying. So here's the street and the.
I wish you could draw me a
That's what I'm
picture.
saying. So if here's the one, this is this is what I'm saying is contiguous. The street is contiguous to the lot. So I'm trying to say this street, that was what I was addressing, meaning the street right in front of the lot. The street contiguous to the lot.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So wait a second. So if no street improvements exist already on the lot, then I don't have to improve them because they don't already exist?
No street improvements exist on the same side of the street, okay, but then what street? The street contiguous to the lot. Oh, okay, this street, 1850 North.
I'm with you. Okay. Okay.
In both directions, one
Got
or
it.
both directions.
Okay.
That-
I think I got it.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Item D discussed the payments and things, so it mentions that the developer has two choices. They can essentially give the city money for the cost of their improvements, or they can do a deferral agreement. The deferral agreement needs to be recorded against the property, but the payment that's not recorded in any way. So going forward, are we just going to assume that if there is the lack of a deferral agreement, then this developer has paid the city, and then it's up to the city to cover it?
I left this one mainly as exists currently in our code as an option. Now, I'm thinking the option is the city's option, but because historically, we used to actually get the money. We said, okay, if you want to do the improvement, we had the city engineer do a bond estimate and say it's going to cost $10,000 to put in, well, let's just say $2,000 to put in the sidewalk in front of your house. We're going to defer that, give us the money. Well, but then it would go in this pot, and by the time it was time to build the sidewalk, it was not enough money to build the sidewalk. So now we've changed course and said, you know what, we're not going to collect that money and have to manage it and account for it. We're just going to enter into a deferral agreement and tell them that they will have to pay for this if and when the city tells them they have to pay for it. And it's a pretty strict agreement. It just says when we tell you. Now we give them a few months, sometimes up to 6 months, because some of these are for $20,000 and not everybody has that. But it's recorded against, we record the deferral agreement against the property so it runs with the land. So that's why I left them both in. We are no longer accepting the money. We are only doing the deferral, but I can't say that in the future a council or someone else may say, no, we need to go back to actually collecting the money.
This is what happened in Farmington, and all of the residents were
That's the issue of
coming
Farmington.
out with pitchforks. Yeah.
Well, and Farmington, in my view, made a mistake because they wanted to call on the deferral agreement, but the calling on the deferral agreement was broader in the street scope based on the new high school. So the requirement of dedication of land and the street improvements, now you're looking $50, $60, $70, $120,000. And I think that's where the city made the mistake is they were calling on the deferral agreement in a configuration of the street that they wanted today, not in the configuration of the planned street when it was in the past. And that was a huge huge problem, and I think in the case of Farmington, they had to re-look at what they thought the deferral agreement meant.
Yeah, and
fund
deferral
it
agreements do have those issues. I mean, we have to manage them, we have to keep track of them, and so that's why it's usually my advice that we, you know, not enter into these, because you are taking a risk, and then you have to try and collect. The property ownership may have changed hands, so it's definitely not optimal to go after money or have people plan for that, but it's best to have the improvements go in at the time.
So when the city decides to call on that deferral agreement, if the person doesn't do it, don't pay for it, the property owner doesn't pay for it, is the recourse then like essentially a foreclosure? Is that the recourse, or what's the recourse?
I think there's some options under that, but I think the city also has the option to just put a lien on the property, and sometimes those liens can go out with the taxes. But we've been pretty successful. So for instance, on Frontage Road, whenever we do projects, we have them all mapped out. Our GIS guy, Mike Smith, has them all mapped out and keeps track of them. And when we go into an area, and we did this on Frontage Road when we were getting ready to put some sidewalks in, we called on a couple of those deferral agreements, and some didn't quite have the money, so we entered into an installment payment and some things like that. So we do have to work with them and understand that it's a financial issue and a financial burden.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have a lot of existing deferrals?
Yes, we have about 68 deferral agreements.
About or precisely?
About. It could be 58, I can't remember, but we do have a lot. And it's, yeah, I am not in favor of them.
And I think this is where, you know, in a perfect world, your capital improvements planning, budgeting, going out, looking at the deferral agreements when it's appropriate so that you can partner your capital improvement expenditure with the deferral agreement in a reasonable amount of time, because I think that was, again, a mistake in Farmington. Some of these deferral agreements were very long ago and nearly forgotten about by a number of property owners. And it's really bad to have a lot of deferral agreements. It's really not healthy to have a lot of deferral. And that's why the staff, we have been, you know, berated at council meetings as the worst people on the planet. And you know, in a council, I mean, like you gotta feel for them. These are the people that they answer to, and in that moment, they're thinking, "Wow, how can I help Joe or Sally?" And staff is like, "Okay, this is 152 now." You know, it's scary.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. We were out visiting my grandkids in Ohio, and they took us down to a kind of a nice subdivision where they wanted to go trick-or-treating because they live way out in the country. There are no houses around them, so they go down to the rich area to trick-or-treat, of course. And this subdivision is a beautiful subdivision, but only about half the houses are built. So you'd have a house and then an empty lot and a house and an empty lot. And they're very nice homes. Sidewalks in front of the houses, no sidewalks in front of the empty lots. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. And it was clearly a platted subdivision, but somehow they deferred putting the sidewalks in until the lot was sold.
And then you never know when the lots.
You just never know when the
get
lots are
sold.
sold.
And we get that problem with subdividers, is we require the installation of the improvements.
Sure.
And the first thing they will always say, and it's rightly so, well, if I put the sidewalk in and then I have to build and the cement truck comes in and breaks up the sidewalk, you know, I'd rather put it in later. Mm-hmm. And that's a completely reasonable thought pattern. But for us, when you have a 30-lot subdivision and the market shifts and you got half the subdivision that takes another 15 years to develop, and so we have this common sense to them versus we get stuck with what you don't finish. Yep. And that's a problem.
It was the strangest thing. Anyway, any other discussion? This is scheduled for public hearing, so I probably ought to open public hearing for the record, and I will also close the public hearing for the record, seeing no one coming forward to comment. Any further discussion or debate?
No, I just think that I generally like the idea of cleaning up the deferral agreement section here. I think there's a lot of cases where deferral agreements don't make sense, but I do like the idea of discussing the idea more of designated areas where we might decide that we don't want sidewalks and other things like that, but then involving others in that discussion, so.
Yeah, I agree. And even in the Jennings Lane thing, if, you know, Jennings Lane is the old part of New Centerville, okay? I live in the neighborhood, and you know, when we moved into a more traditional subdivision where all the sidewalks and curbs and gutters were in, but there were these few little pockets that had been developed several, you know, decades before ours, and those were literally lanes up to farmhouses, and there wasn't anything built along those lanes, and so when the road went in and houses started being built along it, it was pretty rural still.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think there are some places in Centerville that are like that.
I even like it when it isn't curb and gutter. Engineers don't like that because they got to figure out with the water, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that I think it's fine if a neighborhood doesn't want sidewalk and curb and gutter. I understand, and I like, thinking back to Logan's comment about, over planning, but I tend to agree with Shaylin for safety reasons. I think we need to be careful about designating those areas that we don't, cause safety issues, so.
Yeah. Very good. Anything else, or should we move to motion? I'd entertain a motion. Someone would like to make it?
I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend to the City Council to approve the proposed amendments as presented by the City Attorney for suggested reasons for the action A through C in staff report.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? We'll go ahead and vote. Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
So that was just leaving it as drafted?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You're welcome, Lisa.
That's drafted. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for your work. Next matter we can take care of in short order. This is a preliminary subdivision of Moss Acres, 2026 North Main, and for the record, I understand it's off the table right now. Great.
Yeah, this is the preliminary, and the report that was due didn't get submitted.
Didn't get submitted, so we'll move that to the next meeting. We have in our packets tonight a schedule for next year's Planning Commission meetings, and it looks like we may have a conflict on February 14th.
It's my anniversary. I'm out.
Well, you got
It's my in-laws' anniversary too. I know. I don't know.
That's weird.
I really liked her,
Okay.
so I.
That's joyous. You only have to
Did
get
we,
one.
did we not get that changed in next week?
Yeah.
Because Donna was calling the recorder's office to see if the building was available the following week.
Oh, really? I had.
Huh. Well, it's proposed, so that's a conflict.
Well, it's a conflict. Tuesday the 13th is probably open. We can defer this discussion to see what days
Yeah,
are
we
open.
approve the schedule with the clarification on the February date at your next meeting, and we'll bring you back when the building is actually available. If we can get it on the 13th and you're okay with that, we can try for that.
Okay. Let's get a motion on the table for that. Anyone like to make that motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the proposed 2018 meeting schedule as designated in staff's report, with the exception of determining availability for the February 14th meeting.
For an alternate date, you mean?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Second motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
I am intrigued by the idea that we could change the meeting location. Wouldn't it be fun to do this out in the Bowery in the middle of the summer?
Ooh, I was gonna, yeah, I
Just
thought you were
saying.
gonna say in February. I was like, no.
No. I'm totally kidding.
You know what? I kind of like the idea
Yeah,
of
I do too.
in a dream way.
Yeah.
It's the recording of the meeting that gets a little awkward.
Could be. All right, any further discussion for weird comments?
Oh, come on. Cheeky.
As far as recording the meeting, we'll just have Corey stand there with his phone and he can stream it.
It doesn't say how it has to be recorded. I mean, we could just get a, yeah.
That's good. Great idea.
Facebook Live, there we go.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you.
I'm opposed to the weird comment.
So is that accepting?
Okay. Last but not least, we have two sets of minutes to review tonight. The first is minutes of the City Council and Planning Commission joint work session held on Wednesday, November 15th at 5:30. And we'll just go through these page by page. Any comments on page 1? Page 2, I was wondering, and I wasn't at the meeting, so I'm just going to raise it for interest's sake. On line 19, it doesn't seem to, the sentence doesn't end. Recommendations from what? Or to control blight, and that it is the standpoint that he will be looking at recommendations from whom?
I think he meant from the Planning Commission, right?
From the Planning Commission?
That's kind of what I'm recalling.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty respectful of saying, hey, I want to have the Planning Commission weigh in. Whether I agree or not, I want him to weigh in.
And he seldom does.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would suggest that change. Anything else on page 2?
This just caught my eye in line 22. Councilwoman Meekum reiterated the differences between Centerville's Main Street and neighboring cities' main streets. I think she meant not a single city, but neighboring cities.
And streets.
And streets
yeah.
would not be, so CITIES apostrophe, and then just main streets without the
Yes.
apostrophe.
Okay, anything else on page 2? Page 3? Page 4? Page 5? Page 6? Need a motion?
I move we adopt the minutes of the joint work session on November 15th, 2017 as amended.
Adopt or approve?
I meant approve.
And-
Sorry.
And I assume, do we know if the council has approved these yet, Lisa?
Yes, I think they did at the last meeting.
Without any change? Okay.
They're not as thorough as we are.
Second?
I'll second.
Got a motion and a second to approve. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we move now to the minutes of the Planning Commission meeting held on November 15th, 2017. I'll just go through this page by page as well. Any comments on page 1? Should the word aesthetic on line 48 be aesthetics?
Oh, can you say that in the singular?
The aesthetic of the neighborhood. Aesthetics of the neighborhood?
I was okay with it being singular.
I'm fine. I don't know. Anything else on page 1? Page 2?
Yeah, one minor thing. On line 32, it's Nancy Robinson, and then we have Nancy Robertson, and then immediately Mrs. Robinson, so.
The song, the second one?
Yeah.
Is it Robinson?
It's Robinson. Yeah.
Robinson.
Where have you gone, Mrs. Robinson?
Second.
I've got a question, and maybe this is just a term of art, but on line 3, where it says, the phrase starts, is no longer needed and is essentially being surplused, is that an actual word? Or is being deemed surplus land? I guess that's what it really means, right?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a real word.
Just never seen surplus used quite in that sense before.
Two surplus.
Yeah, it's probably one of those planner words.
Oh. It might be a word with only one S.
Surplus, I don't know.
That sounds like an excellent Scrabble question.
The quick Google search doesn't show surplus as being a verb, so.
Yeah, I think it maybe is being deemed, or is deemed surplus land, might be a little better. Not to put words in your mouth.
No, nowadays you have to look up in the dictionary.
Anything else on page 2? Page 3? On line 26, divided into 3 larger lots because they felt the size of the lot. The size lot. I don't
Or the
know.
lot size.
Larger
The
size.
lot size.
The lot size, yeah.
So just switch lot and size?
Yeah, that's fine. You need, anything else on page 3? Page 4? Page 5?
I just have one on line 15 to delete the word public. It is not the city's land, and the city does not have the money to acquire it.
Okay. Anything else on page 5? Page 6? Page 7? Page 8? Page 9? Page 10? Can I have a motion?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes of the Planning Commission meeting held on November 15th, 2017, as amended.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you.
I would say, Avalon, that was well done with the minutes. That was good.
So we'll turn it over to Corey to give us a report on what's happening.
Just a couple of things. We already have items for your January. Believe it or not, it's not faltering. Some kickover and some tables, but there's a couple of things that people want to schedule, so we have that ready, be prepared for you. Think about the election, chair and vice chair again this year. We save that for your following meeting. Also, just be aware that I've had discussions with the mayor and the city manager. They weren't as clear, so this was my take, and I'm asking you if you took the same take on it. But the work session for the Main Street, I took the impression that we would schedule sometime early next year a work session with the commission. 2 components that I took from the meeting was to take into Councilman Intz's straw poll. We do something simple where everybody could say, these are the uses we love, these are the uses we hate, so that we can see that kind of in a neutral pattern. We would also put together what's allowed on Main Street currently, and then look at the use lists on things that are prohibited that could be considered. And that we would prepare these 2 documents for your work session with the city council. So if that covers the basis, and that's what the city manager will, so we anticipate that's, I'll let you know when they kind of commit to a work session in advance. I told Steve that we need 2 weeks in advance for any publication for the meeting. So they need to plan that out a little further in advance so we can communicate that with the dates with the commission. So we'll do that.
Yeah, Corey, just to make sure that all those things you listed for what to consider sound great. As long as we don't forget the list of the items that we've had to turn down because
yeah,
permitted.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because it doesn't exactly fall in one that you talked about, because,
right.
You know, maybe we've turned some things down for good reason, but.
No, talk about the things that
yeah,
by default just end up disappearing and could have been considered into there. Good point. So we'll plan that work session. Also be thinking, I know you're probably gravely disappointed, but our goals, I'm not even sure we got anywhere close to their goals. So you're looking already by March, the council's preparing for budget and beginning to discuss those. So by April, I'm submitting the department budget. In March, I'm submitting goals of the community development department. And as part of that, I usually put the commissions and the landmarks commission goals being recommended to the city council. So we will raise that issue of what was in your past that you had set forward and try to sort out maybe next year of being more successful with accomplishing some of those goals, because I'm not sure we got into any from my standpoint. A lot of things sidelined it. And the other thing I think we're taking from our standpoint, Lisa has suggested that she has a goal. I'm not sure it came from Lisa, but a goal each year to tackle something to improve in the department. And so I think there's a few things that we'll discuss on our level that we will bring up that may involve the zoning ordinance. And then we can't technically propose zoning ordinance changes. It's the commission, the council, or an application. And so we'll bring those matters up if it involves the zoning ordinance.
You know, what may be really helpful is in discussions with other land use gurus around the state, that several cities are really moving towards streamlining some of the things that we consider here.
And you had that goal.
Voting, public hearing, it's been one of our goals. I would really like to see some recommendations from staff or council about where we can start drawing some meaningful lines there. Because
and I think
we
that's
could accomplish more of our goals.
Yeah, and I think the mistake, for lack of better terms, because then I have to carry the burden of that mistake. But I think the difficulty is the commission wants to streamline that so you can do some more proactive planning, and we certainly support that from our level. It's been a contentious year on a number of issues. The difficult part from our standpoint is to go up to the council and say, trust us, we can do this. So I think to be more successful, it would be more of the work sessions so that this group can express your goals and desires to function as citizen planners. It's not just staff grabbing at more opportunities to do things that aren't as publicly seen and heard. So I think that's a good strategy, that we sit down and have a little more serious discussion about the streamlining and what you're trying to accomplish with your citizen planner roles, rather than just react to every site plan that comes.
And I assume we'll have that meeting relatively early on with the council to discuss our goals, and that's a good place where it could be expressed.
Yeah. So I think those, move forward with the next year. And then just lastly, I am just always grateful. Centerville as a city to work for. This April will be 14 years. I have never saw myself here for 14 years, and it wasn't because I didn't like it. It's just, that's a long time for a planner to play in a community without irritating everybody and run out on the rails. And so I've been grateful for particularly the planning commissions of this city. I mean, I'm grateful for the leaders of the city, don't get me wrong, but they have so much on their plate. I just work really hard with the commissions, and the commissions that have been here with the Centerville City have been the best. And whether we've agreed or not agreed, you're engaged, you're well spoken. Even if it's intimidating, sometimes I wonder if it's intimidating to individual commissioners, but you'll stand for something that's important to you, and you'll share it, and you seem to be having at least comfortable enough to do that and have those disagreements, and I wouldn't even call them disagreements, they're just preferences, and there's directions to go on those preferences, and neither one is the perfect answer. So I'm just grateful, and it's Christmas time to tell you I'm grateful for every one of you. Yeah, it's helped with the longevity here. If it weren't for the good commissions, then I would be all by myself, and that would be more scary. So I'm just grateful to you. You've been great.
Well, thank you, Corey, and all of us can say some parting words, but I'd like to publicly express our appreciation for staff, because certainly we could not do our job well if we didn't have good staff supporting us, and your staff reports are excellent, and your by and large, your recommendations have been spot on. And I've appreciated the fact that you present alternatives and give us the opportunity to think and to debate and to ponder, and I think that's important in this process. So thank you.
And Cassie made it off probation, so
Yeah.
she stuck with us for a while.
Yeah. Cassie also won most of the prizes at the city party, I think.
Yeah.
So she's definitely in the game.
Yep.
Well, thank you all. Anybody want to adjourn this meeting, or should we just?
Oh, I
party
make a
on?
motion that we adjourn.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. Merry Christmas, everybody.